looking at the internet weather for the last week or so here, we had been reporting on some reflection attacks that were using SNMP, and I think last week we reported that it was coming down. It still is coming down, but I want to keep this into perspective. I think last week I showed sort of a composite that showed that this SNMP attack activity is relatively small compared to a lot of the other contributions to reflection attacks, denial of service attacks. But we should also keep in mind here, even though this peaked out at about, around the order of about 2 gigabits per second, which is not huge for a denial of service attack, it's still significant from most end users' point of view. There aren't too many end users that have 2 gigabits of traffic capacity at their disposal due to a denial of service attack. Even if we look at what's going on relatively recently, and we're looking at 30 days of activity here, but even if we look at what's going on relatively recently, it's still, around 10, what are we looking at? We're looking at hundreds of megabits, about 100 megabits per second in this attack activity here. So it still would be significant to most end users. And so you need to be prepared for these types of attacks. And as I pointed out earlier, this is just a small portion of what is the collective amount of denial of service attack activity. Perhaps we'll cover it next week, but Arbor Networks came out with a report relatively recently indicating that they detected the largest denial of service attack in the first quarter of 2015. I think they measured it around 334 gigabits per second.
Is that the largest ever in the first quarter, or is that the largest of just the first quarter?
The largest what they've witnessed, I think, in the first quarter of 2015, the largest they've witnessed so far.
Okay.
Next item here, we had been talking over the last few weeks about scanned sources on port 4143 as well as 4183. We were sort of speculating that it was the P2P traffic, but we weren't able to basically confirm that it was actually P2P traffic. So we're looking at 60 days of activity here, and the good news is, perhaps, the activity has tapered off. In terms of the number of sources, we're looking at the number of sources producing that activity. It's still present, but certainly not as significant as it was before, and it's still somewhat of a mystery why they're doing this. Now, as we point out before, and with the latest check still consistent with what we've been witnessing, there is a very clear geographic distribution, that is the port 4143 seems to be predominantly originating from the United States, whereas the port 4183 seems to be predominantly originating from either Europe or actually South America, as it's showing here. And not even that much in Asia, relatively speaking. You don't see really any dots in India there, and very few in China. So that's relatively unusual considering what the population distribution is and what you might expect to see. So very curious patterns associated with this activity. Next item here is probes on port 5800 TCP. Now that's associated with virtual network computing, and we've seen a lot of cases in the past. We actually have reported a number of times, not so much recently, but a number of times in the past on port 5900, and sometimes even 5901, 5902, that are all associated with VNC. But in this particular case, we're seeing it probing on port 5800. Of course, as you can see from the graph here, it's not new that we're seeing this probing activity. Most of these big spikes are associated with a source or a set of sources from China. Those are the big spikes. What we're seeing relatively recently here is this activity down in the lower right-hand corner, and that is the introduction of basically activity from a U.S. hosting provider. There are actually a couple of addresses that appear to be participating in the activity. So we'll follow that to see how that develops in time.
Yeah, and just a quick thing to point out the difference. 5900 is used by the native client, and 5800 is a web interface to VNC. If you're managing something with VNC and you've enabled the VNC over HTTP, that's what runs on 5800.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jim. Next item here is the most probed ports, is the top 10. No real significant revelations here. We've had a little bit of movement. It looks like port 1433 has moved up about 5 slots. 53 UDP has moved up about 6 slots here. But those are all generally ones that we have seen in the past on this, basically on this pie chart. So at the top of the list, port 22 TCP, that's SSH, followed by 445 TCP. We're going to take a little closer look at that in a moment. And then 1433 TCP, followed by port 23 TCP. 53 UDP, most likely probing. And actually, I was looking at this a little more closely, and the port 53, as you know, we've seen more denial of service attacks on port 53 lately, just kind of flooding DNS servers, and that's not unusual, but seemed to have some recent spikes in that space, whereas it seemed to have relaxed for a period of time, but seems to have come back. We might have an explanation for that, perhaps something to talk about next week. Followed by port 80 TCP, 8080 TCP 3389, which is basically a, I'll call it a peer to the VNC that we just talked about. That's the remote desktop protocol. And then port 123 UDP, again, that's a case where it's likely either probing for network time servers, NTP servers that might be used for reflection attack activity, or perhaps some indications of using it. This next piece here just shows the scan probes on port 445 TCP. You know, as I'd mentioned, it's still way up there near the top in terms of the number of probes. It's interesting that we've seen that moving a little bit here. And in fact, what we're seeing is that over the last year, we're looking at the last year of activity. The top graph is looking at the number of probes. The bottom graph is looking at the number of sources doing those probes. So whereas with the configure kind of evaporating, we are seeing what we'd expect to see, fewer sources doing the probing activity. But what we've seen showing in the top graph there's a slight increase in the trend in terms of the number of probes that we're seeing on the network, and actually some spiky activity more recently, even in the last month or so. So I don't really have a good explanation for that, other than the fact that perhaps there are some individuals that are out there that are, you know, probing the port, perhaps looking for holes in people's firewalls. You know, 445 on the internet to me just you know, kind of baffles me. It's not one of those things you would expect to see out there, but apparently it is.
I wonder if the default stance for Windows has changed since maybe the XP years onwards to 7 or 8. Are those ports still open by default, or are they perhaps closed by default now? And it's one, there's less of a scanning population to go around, and two, XP boxes are slowly being taken out of service. Possible explanation? Total speculation?
Well, certainly the XP box is taken out of service, I think, as a contributing factor to the reduction in the number of sources that are doing the scanning. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, Jim, maybe you have some thoughts. I tend to go to you as the sort of the Windows expert. Have there been any changes in the default configuration in Windows to perhaps inhibit the use of, you know, basically file sharing or SMB on the
Well, no,
devices?
not really. Although it's possible that there's a little less of it if you configure, you know, if you've ever connected a recent Windows box, Windows 7, Windows 8.1,
mm-hmm.
whatever, to your network, for the first time, you'll get this little pop-up: is this a home network, a work network, you know,
mm-hmm.
or a public network? And if you say public, then it actually does tighten up the firewall rules and doesn't open up quite as much. But you know, for your home networks and your work networks, the WINS ports, the AD ports, you know, the 445s are all open to anything
mm-hmm.
in the local network. So unless you're constantly saying you're on a public network, it isn't really that much tighter.
All right. Okay. Well, I think that's significant, though. At least you have the opportunity to think twice about how the computer's connecting on the network. So.
Yeah, and it only does that, prompts you for that, though, the first time you connect to a given network.
Mm-hmm.
If you later want to change that, you've got to dig back through the control panel and the network settings and all of that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next item here is the top 10 most sources doing the probing, and quite frankly, not a lot of movement here. We're seeing a lot of the same ports, 445 at the top of the list, followed by port 23 TCP, 27015. Some of these others are actually associated with peer-to-peer protocols, BitTorrent gaming activities. 17788 UDP is one that we considered to be a little bit of a mystery that's been growing in activity, but I'm inclined to believe that's innocuous. So we're going to investigate that a little bit further. No updates on that at this point.